August 15, 1945. Tinian Island, Northern Marianas. The air still carried the burnt tang of aviation fuel and the ghost heat of a Pacific summer that never seemed to end. Across the coral hardstand, rows of aluminum giants sat silent for the first time in months, their right arc 3350 engines cooling, their bomb bays empty, their massive shadows stretching across runways that only days before had pulsed with the rhythm of total war. The B-29 Superfortresses, those silver titans that had carried fire to the heart of the Japanese Empire, now rested like exhausted gods who had just learned their work was finished. Inside the operations tent, Lieutenant Colonel James Harwood stood before a wall map still studded with red pins marking targets that would never be struck. The surrender had come so suddenly that half the crews were still suited up, still psychologically prepared for missions that would never fly. He removed his cap and ran his fingers through sweat-dampened hair, staring at the rows of aircraft outside. 43 B-29s under his command. Each one had cost the American taxpayers $639,000, more than 3 times the price of a B-17, more than a small warship. Each one represented the pinnacle of American engineering, the most advanced bomber ever built. Each one was, as of this morning, obsolete in ways no one yet fully understood. The silence felt wrong. For 18 months, this island had roared with the sound of those massive engines. 2,200 horsepower per engine, 4 engines per plane, dozens of planes launching every night. The Superfortress had been more than a weapon, it had been a promise made manifest, a declaration that American industrial might could compress distance itself, could reach across an ocean and remake the world in fire and precision. Now that promise hung in the tropical air like a question no one quite knew how to answer. What happens to weapons built for a war that suddenly ends? The B-29 had never been designed for peace. Its creation was an act of desperate faith, conceived in 1940 when Europe was falling and the possibility of fighting a two-ocean war seemed both inevitable and impossible. The Army Air Corps had issued a specification so ambitious that it bordered on fantasy, a bomber capable of carrying 1 ton of bombs for 5,000 miles at 300 miles per hour at an altitude of 30,000 feet. Nothing remotely close existed. The request demanded technological leaps that would require inventing new metallurgy, new engines, new theories of high-altitude flight. Boeing took the contract and promised the impossible. They would build a pressurized cabin so crews could operate in the thin air of the stratosphere without oxygen masks. They would mount 4 engines more powerful than anything yet flown. They would create a remote-controlled gunnery system that turned the aircraft into a flying fortress commanded from a central station. They would design a bomb bay large enough to carry the theoretical atomic weapons that a few physicists had begun whispering about in classified briefings. The prototype first flew in September 1942, and within minutes, everyone involved knew they had created something unprecedented. The B-29 was enormous, 99 feet long with a wingspan of 141 feet, weighing 74 tons fully loaded. It could cruise at 350 miles per hour, faster than most fighters of 1940. Its pressurized cabin allowed the crew to operate in shirt sleeves at 32,000 feet while enemy fighters struggled in the thin air below. Its 4 Wright Cyclone engines each generated 2,200 horsepower, breathing through turbo-superchargers that forced air into the cylinders with mechanical violence. But the complexity came with cost. The engines caught fire with terrifying regularity, incinerating prototypes and crews. The remote gunnery system jammed. The pressurization failed catastrophically at altitude. The magnesium components corroded. The cost per aircraft spiraled beyond any bomber ever built. By 1944, the B-29 program had consumed $3 billion, more than the Manhattan Project that was secretly building the atomic bomb it would eventually carry. They built them anyway. American factories, tooled up to a scale that defied belief, began stamping out superfortresses at a pace of over 100 per month. By mid-1944, they were flying from China and India, attempting to reach Japanese factories from bases supplied by airlift over the Himalayas. By early 1945, when Saipan, Tinian, and Guam fell to American forces, the B-29s had bases within range of the Japanese home islands, and the strategic bombing campaign began in earnest. The results were apocalyptic. On the night of March 9, 1945, 334 B-29s dropped 1,665 tons of incendiaries on Tokyo, creating a firestorm that killed over 100,000 people and destroyed 16 square miles of the city. The bombers returned again and again, Nagoya, Osaka, Kobe, Yokohama, systematically burning Japan's industrial heart into ash and rubble. Then, in August, 2 specially modified B-29s carried atomic weapons to Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and the war ended in a flash of nuclear light that made conventional bombing suddenly feel like ancient history. By war's end, nearly 4,000 B-29 Superfortresses had been built. They had flown over 31,000 sorties, dropped 171,000 tons of bombs, and killed hundreds of thousands. They had cost the United States nearly $2 billion to produce. And now, on airfields across the Pacific, they sat idle, their missions complete, their purpose suddenly uncertain. The American military had never faced a peace quite like this one. Previous wars had ended with gradual demobilization, weapons stored or scrapped at leisure. But 1945 was different. The atomic bomb had split history itself. The B-29s had been built to fight a war of industrial attrition against enemies who could be worn down through material superiority. But if future wars would be decided by atomic weapons delivered by intercontinental bombers, what role remained for fleets of conventional heavy bombers? The answer would reveal itself slowly, in decisions both pragmatic and symbolic, as America tried to understand what it had become in the crucible of total war. In the immediate aftermath of surrender, the military faced a logistical nightmare disguised as a blessing. Across the Pacific theater, hundreds of B-29s sat on bases that had been carved from jungle and coral at immense cost. Getting them home would require flying them across thousands of miles of ocean, or dismantling them and shipping them on vessels that were desperately needed to bring 12 million servicemen back to the United States. The decision came swiftly, most would not come home. Beginning in September 1945, crews received orders that felt like betrayal. Perfectly functional B-29s, machines that had survived combat missions over Japan, were to be taxied to designated areas and abandoned. Pilots who had coaxed these complex aircraft across the Pacific, who had nursed failing engines and fought through flak and fighters, now walked away from them on remote islands, leaving them to the corrosive embrace of tropical weather. On Tinian, on Guam, on Saipan, hundreds of superfortresses were simply parked in rows and left. Without maintenance, the jungle began its patient work. Vines crept across wings. Salt air corroded aluminum. Tropical rains pooled inside bomb bays. Within months, aircraft that had cost more than $500,000 each had become silent monuments to a conflict that was already receding into memory. Others were quite literally pushed into the sea. At several Pacific bases, crews were ordered to taxi B-29s to cliff edges or specially constructed ramps and roll them into the ocean. The rationale was coldly practical. If left intact, the aircraft might be salvaged by potential adversaries, or might become legal liabilities if they caused accidents or took up space needed for post-war operations. Better to destroy them deliberately than risk their technology falling into the wrong hands or their hulks becoming bureaucratic problems. Crews watched in stunned silence as bombers that had carried them through fire were shoved over cliffs to tumble into the Pacific, wings shearing off, fuselages crumpling, the ocean swallowing millions of dollars of precision engineering in seconds. It felt sacrilegious, a violation of some unspoken bond between men and the machines that had kept them alive. But orders were orders, and the peace demanded sacrifices different from those of war. Back in the continental United States, the calculus was slightly different but no less brutal. Hundreds of B-29s had never left American soil, they had been built too late, or assigned to training units, or held in reserve against a Japanese invasion that never came. These aircraft were flown to massive storage facilities in the Southwest, where the dry desert air would preserve them against immediate decay. The largest of these graveyards emerged in the desert outside Tucson, Arizona. What would eventually become Davis-Monthan Air Force Base began as a vast parking lot for warplanes America no longer needed. B-29s arrived by the dozen, flown in by ferry crews who would then hitchhike back to other bases to collect more. They were arranged in precise rows, wingtip to wingtip, their silvery skins reflecting the brutal desert sun. Here, at least, preservation was the goal. The bombers were cocooned, engines pickled with preservative oils, cockpit windows covered, gun ports sealed against blowing sand. The theory was that they might be needed again, that some future emergency might require pulling these giants back into service. But even as they were mothballed, everyone involved understood the deeper truth: these were not reserves being stored for future use. They were expensive machines being kept long enough to make their disposal politically palatable. Because something fundamental had changed in the nature of air power, and the B-29, for all its technological sophistication, represented the past rather than the future. The transformation had begun even before the war ended. In the secret laboratories and proving grounds where America's next generation of weapons was being conceived, a new kind of bomber was taking shape. It would be faster, fly higher, carry heavier loads, and most importantly, be designed from the beginning around the atomic bomb. The B-29 had carried the first atomic weapons as an adaptation. The Enola Gay and Boxcar had required extensive modifications to carry the bulky uranium and plutonium devices. The next generation would need no such adaptations. Development of what would become the B-36 Peacemaker and the B-47 Stratojet accelerated in 1946. These aircraft represented philosophies of air power fundamentally different from the Superfortress. The B-36 was a 10-engine monster with intercontinental range. It could strike Moscow from bases in Texas without refueling. The B-47 was a swept-wing jet that could outrun most contemporary fighters and operate at altitudes where interception was nearly impossible. Both were conceived for the atomic age, designed to penetrate Soviet air defenses and deliver nuclear annihilation. Against these emerging leviathans, the B-29 suddenly looked antiquated despite being barely 3 years old. Its piston engines, however powerful, could not match jet speed. Its defensive armament, designed to ward off Japanese fighters, would be useless against MiG-15s that could attack from above at speeds approaching the sound barrier. Its bomb load, impressive in 1944, was insufficient for the massive hydrogen bombs already being designed. And its range, while adequate for the Pacific War, could not reach the heart of the Soviet Union from American bases. The military's enthusiasm for keeping thousands of B-29s evaporated as budgets tightened and newer aircraft entered service. By 1948, most of the Superfortresses mothballed in the desert were being pulled from storage, not for return to service, but for scrapping. The aluminum was valuable, after all. That same metal could be recycled into new aircraft, or sold to civilian manufacturers for the commercial aircraft boom that was transforming American aviation. Scrapping followed an efficient, heartbreaking process. Specialized crews descended on the storage fields with cutting torches and heavy equipment. They stripped the valuable components first. Engines were pulled and rebuilt for sale to cargo operators. Instruments were salvaged for training simulators. Gun turrets were removed for museum display or testing facilities. Then the cutting began. Wings were severed from fuselages. Tail sections collapsed under controlled demolition. The aluminum skin was cut into manageable sections and loaded onto trucks bound for smelting facilities. A B-29 that had taken 18 months to design, required 60,000 engineering drawings to specify, and consumed 3,970 pounds of aluminum, 1,200 pounds of copper, and 600,000 man-hours to build could be reduced to scrap metal in less than a week. The speed of the destruction was stunning. By 1950, of the nearly 4,000 Superfortresses built, fewer than 700 remained in active service. Most of those were assigned not to strategic bombing wings but to reconnaissance, weather observation, and air-sea rescue roles. Missions that valued their range and payload capacity but did not require cutting-edge performance. The era of the B-29 as America's primary strategic deterrent had lasted less than 5 years. Yet even as the great scrapping gathered pace, world events were about to give the Superfortress an unexpected epilogue. June 25, 1950. North Korean forces crossed the 38th parallel in overwhelming strength, smashing through South Korean defenses and driving toward the port of Pusan. The invasion caught American forces almost completely unprepared. The rapid post-war demobilization had left only a skeleton military presence in the Far East. The newest bombers, the B-36s and B-47s, existed in such small numbers that they could not be risked in a regional conflict that might escalate to general war with the Soviet Union. The urgent call went out: mobilize the B-29s. Across the United States, the Superfortresses in desert storage were hastily pulled from mothballs. Crews worked around the clock to reverse the preservation process, removing protective coatings, replacing degraded rubber seals, test-firing engines that had sat idle for years. Many aircraft were found to be unsalvageable, too far gone to corrosion or cannibalization. But enough were restored to form a viable bombing force. By August 1950, B-29s were flying combat missions over Korea from bases in Japan and Okinawa. The aircraft that had burned Japan's cities now struck North Korean industrial targets, bridges, and supply lines. But this was a very different war, and the Superfortress faced challenges its designers had never anticipated. The biggest threat came from Soviet-supplied MiG-15 fighters. These swept-wing jets could climb to 50,000 feet, well above the B-29's operational ceiling, and dive on the bombers at speeds exceeding 600 miles per hour. The Superfortress's defensive armament, so effective against piston-engine Japanese fighters, was nearly useless. The remotely aimed, 50 caliber machine guns could not track targets moving at such speeds, and the MiGs could attack from angles the guns could not cover. The first major engagement came in October 1951, when 9 B-29s attacked the North Korean city of Namsi. MiG-15s swarmed the formation, their 37mm cannons shredding the bomber's aluminum skin. 3 Superfortresses were shot down, and 5 others were so badly damaged that they barely made it back to base. The B-29, for all its sophistication, had become a liability. By 1952, most superfortresses in Korea were shifted to night operations, where the MiG's lack of radar and effective night fighting equipment gave the bombers some protection. Others were converted to specialized roles: aerial refueling tankers, electronic warfare platforms, reconnaissance aircraft. A few were modified to carry enormous searchlights for night interdiction missions, illuminating North Korean supply columns for attacking fighters. But the writing was on the aluminum skin. When the Korean War ended in armistice in July 1953, the B-29 was swiftly retired from frontline service. The few remaining in the active inventory were relegated to training, reserve units, and second-line roles. By 1960, the last B-29 was retired from U.S. military service, exactly 20 years after the first prototype had flown. The Superfortress had lasted 2 decades, a respectable lifespan for an aircraft, but a shockingly brief one for a weapon system that had cost so much and promised so much more. Yet the story did not end with military retirement. The B-29's unique combination of range, payload, and relative availability made it attractive for roles far removed from strategic bombing. The most extensive post-military use came from an unexpected source, the British Royal Air Force. In 1950, facing a shortage of heavy bombers and delays in their own jet bomber programs, Britain purchased 88 B-29s from U.S. surplus stocks. Rechristened the Washington, the Superfortress served as Britain's primary strategic deterrent until sufficient numbers of Vickers Valiants and Avro Vulcans entered service in the mid-1950s. British crews found the aircraft complex and maintenance-intensive, but appreciated its range and the implicit strategic partnership with the United States that the purchase represented. In civilian hands, the B-29 enjoyed a more creative second life. The aircraft's pressurized cabin and long range made it attractive as a high-altitude research platform. NASA and its predecessor organization, NACA, used modified superfortresses for atmospheric research, cosmic ray studies, and testing experimental aircraft. One B-29 was converted to drop-test the Bell X-1 rocket plane, while others carried experimental jet engines mounted in various configurations to test propulsion concepts that would eventually power commercial airliners. A few superfortresses were converted into luxury transports. With most of the military equipment stripped out and the bomb bay converted into cargo space, a B-29 could carry substantial freight or a dozen passengers in relative comfort across distances that few civilian aircraft of the era could match. Small airlines operated them on routes to Alaska, across the Pacific, and throughout South America, where their ability to overfly bad weather and operate from primitive airfields made them uniquely valuable. The weather reconnaissance mission proved to be the longest-lasting military application. Throughout the 1950s, modified B-29s, redesignated as WB-29s, flew Hurricane Hunter missions into the hearts of tropical storms, gathering meteorological data that saved countless lives through improved storm forecasting. These aircraft, their bomb bays packed with scientific instruments instead of explosives, continued flying until 1960, tracking hurricanes from Texas to the Caribbean long after their bomber brethren had been cut up for scrap. But perhaps the most symbolically significant use came from a handful of superfortresses converted into tankers. The KB-29 aerial refueling aircraft pioneered techniques and procedures that would become foundational to modern airpower. The ability to extend the range of fighters and bombers through aerial refueling transformed military aviation, enabling the global reach that defines American airpower today. The B-29, which had been designed to reach enemy targets through sheer range, ended its service life teaching other aircraft how to reach even farther. By the mid-1960s, even these specialized roles had ended. The last B-29 flying in any official capacity was a weather reconnaissance aircraft that made its final flight in 1965. 23 years after the first prototype flew, the Superfortress era was definitively over. Today, fewer than 30 B-29s survive in museums and private collections worldwide. Of the nearly 4,000 built, this represents a survival rate of less than 1%. a shockingly small number for an aircraft so significant. Many of those survivors are displayed as monuments rather than maintained as flyable aircraft. Only 2 remain in airworthy condition, meticulously restored and maintained by dedicated organizations that understand what these machines represent. Fifi, operated by the Commemorative Air Force, and Doc, restored by a group in Kansas, are time machines rendered in aluminum and rivets. When their right engines fire up with their characteristic throaty roar, the sound carries not just the mechanical voice of complex machinery, but the echo of a very specific moment in American history. The moment when industrial capacity, technological innovation, and strategic necessity converged to create a weapon that helped end one era and usher in another. Walk through one of these restored bombers and the complexity is overwhelming. The flight engineer's panel bristles with over 150 gauges, switches, and controls, managing fuel flow, engine temperatures, manifold pressures, and electrical systems requires constant attention. The bombardier's position in the nose offers a view of devastating beauty. From 30,000 feet, the world spreads below in abstract patterns of geography, all of it within range, all of it vulnerable. The gun positions, now empty of weapons, speak to a time when human eyes and reflexes were the ultimate defense against other humans trying to kill you at 300 miles per hour. But more than the technical sophistication, these surviving aircraft embody a paradox that defined America's post-war transformation. The B-29 was simultaneously a culmination and an ending, the most advanced propeller-driven bomber ever built, and the last of its breed. It represented the peak of one technological paradigm even as it ushered in the obsolescence of that paradigm. It was a weapon built for industrial-age warfare deployed at the dawn of the atomic age. In this, the Superfortress serves as a nearly perfect metaphor for America's own transformation in the 1940s. The nation that emerged from World War II was simultaneously the one that had built these magnificent machines and the one that had rendered them obsolete. American power in 1945 rested on vast fleets of B-29s and the industrial capacity to build more, but also on atomic weapons that made those fleets strategically superfluous. The confidence was in the factories that could stamp out bombers by the thousands, and simultaneously in the laboratories that made those bombers unnecessary. The question that faced the B-29 in August 1945, what happens to weapons built for a war that suddenly ends, was really a question about what happens to a nation whose entire economy and society had been mobilized for total war, when that war concludes with unexpected finality. The bombers pushed into the Pacific, cut up in desert boneyards, and repurposed for weather research and corporate transport were physical manifestations of a larger transformation America struggled to manage. You could not simply mothball the industrial capacity that built B-29s. Those factories, those workers, that engineering expertise had to go somewhere, do something. The commercial aircraft boom, the space program, the intercontinental ballistic missile age. All these emerged from the same sources that created the Superfortress, channeling the same energies toward new horizons. And you could not preserve the bomber crew's sense of purpose by parking them in the Arizona desert, waiting for a war that might never come. Those men, navigators who could plot courses across empty ocean, bombardiers who could calculate release points with mechanical precision, pilots who could coax 70 tons of aluminum through thunderstorms and flak. They too needed new missions, new challenges that would give meaning to skills learned in extremis. There is a particular quality of light in the early morning at the National Museum of the United States Air Force in Dayton, Ohio. The sun slants through the enormous hangar windows and catches the silver skin of Bockscar, the B-29 that dropped the atomic bomb on Nagasaki on August 9, 1945. The aircraft sits cordoned behind velvet ropes, meticulously restored but forever grounded, its bomb bay empty, its engines silent. Visitors approach with a mixture of reverence and unease. This machine killed 80,000 people in an instant and helped end a war that had already killed millions. It is simultaneously an instrument of mass destruction and an object of historical significance. Children run past it. It is an artifact of transition, a weapon system conceived in one era, perfected in another, and made obsolete by the very mission it successfully accomplished. The atomic bombs it and Enola Gay delivered rendered strategic bombing fleets like themselves strategically secondary. The future of air power would not be in vast formations of conventional bombers, but in smaller numbers of faster, higher-flying aircraft carrying weapons of exponentially greater power. In that sense, the B-29's rapid obsolescence was not a failure of design or engineering, but the inevitable consequence of its success. It was built to win a specific war against specific enemies using a specific strategy, the systematic destruction of an adversary's industrial capacity through sustained aerial bombardment. It accomplished that mission with brutal efficiency, but in doing so, and in delivering the weapons that made conventional strategic bombing suddenly feel antiquated, it closed the door on its own future. The superfortresses pushed into the sea, melted into ingots in Arizona smelters, shot down over Korea, and converted to weather planes all followed different paths to the same destination, obsolescence in the face of accelerating technological change. Some died violently, some faded quietly, some found new purpose in diminished roles. But all of them, even the preserved museum pieces, represent the same truth. In the modern age, even the most advanced weapons have ever shorter lifespans. Innovation cannibalizes its own child. And yet, there is something deeply American in the trajectory of the B-29, in its rapid development from concept to reality, in its deployment at a scale that defied traditional manufacturing limitations, in its swift obsolescence as newer technologies emerged, and even in the pragmatic ruthlessness with which it was discarded when no longer needed. This is a nation that has always valued innovation over preservation, that builds with the assumption that whatever is built will soon be replaced by something better. The B-29 was not meant to last forever. It was meant to win a war, and when that war ended differently than anyone expected, it was meant to give way to whatever came next. The 4,000 superfortresses built between 1943 and 1946 were not a permanent investment in a specific weapons system, but a temporary mobilization of national capacity toward an urgent goal. When that goal was achieved, the capacity moved on to new challenges, new technologies, new frontiers. Perhaps that is the final answer to the question of what really happened to America's B-29 Superfortress bombers after World War II. They did exactly what they were designed to do, and then, with a speed that would have shocked any previous generation, they became history. Not because they failed, but because they succeeded so completely that they made themselves unnecessary. They won their war and lost their future in the same atomic flash, and in doing so, they revealed the essential rhythm of American power in the modern age: build, deploy, innovate, discard, repeat. The two flying examples today, Fifi and Doc, roaring through airshow skies on summer weekends, drawing crowds who crane their necks to watch aluminum history pass overhead. These are not operational weapons being maintained in reserve. They are memories made tangible, reminders of a moment when the future looked different than it ultimately became. When their engines thunder to life and they lumber down runways, seemingly too heavy to fly but flying anyway, they carry not just their own weight but the weight of a specific historical moment, August 1945, when America had built a weapon so powerful it ended a war, and so advanced it was already obsolete. That is what really happened to the B-29s. They flew into history and kept going, beyond their own time, beyond their own purpose, until only echoes remained. The roar of engines that once filled Pacific skies, now heard only on rare occasions, a sound from a different America, a different world, a different understanding of what it meant to hold the power to reshape the world from 30,000 feet. The bombers themselves are mostly gone, cut up and melted down and scattered across 1,000 purposes far from their original design. But the moment they embodied, that brief window when America had perfected one kind of warfare even as it invented the kind that would replace it, that moment remains frozen in the aluminum skin of the few survivors, waiting in museums and hangars for anyone curious enough to ask, what happened to these magnificent machines? They became what all tools become when the task they were built for suddenly changes, artifacts of the moment just before everything transformed. They are physical punctuation marks at the end of one sentence in the long paragraph of American power, just before the next sentence began with different words, different grammar, different assumptions about what was possible and what was necessary. And in their rapid rise and even more rapid obsolescence, they told a truth about the nation that built them. America would not be bound by its own past, not even a past as recent and as triumphant as 1945. The future was already arriving before the paint dried on the last B-29 to roll off the production line, and that future had no room for yesterday's weapons, no matter how advanced they had seemed just yesterday. That was what really happened to America's B-29 Superfortress bombers after World War II. They won, and then they vanished, and in their vanishing, they revealed what victory means in an age of permanent revolution, not enduring dominance, but the privilege of being first to make yourself obsolete.